All right, let's bring it up to World War II. And what was the event that brought us into that war? Of course, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Japanese planes from aircraft carriers attacked the Pacific Fleet. They sank 18 ships, including 8 battleships, or at least heavily damaged them, if not fully sunk, and left over 2,000 Americans dead. I'm going to give it some extra attention to Pearl Harbor because that's a big one to unravel. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes that might shock some people. This first one is from Russell Grunfeld, British historian and former captain in the Royal Navy. Here's what he wrote in 1952. Quote, "No reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a villainous, unexpected attack on the United States. An attack was not only fully expected, but was actually desired. It is beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into war, but for political reasons was most anxious to ensure that the first act of hostility came from the other side, for which reason he caused increasing pressure to be put on the Japanese, to a point that no self-respecting nation could endure without resort to arms. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States." This man is Oliver Littleton. He was Britain's Minister of Production, and here's what he said to the American Chamber of Congress in London, June the 20th, 1944. "America provoked Japan to such an extent that the Japanese were forced to attack Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty in history ever to say that America was forced into war." So why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? You ask most people that, they can't answer it. Well, here's a kick in the pants. When the Maine went down, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was Teddy Roosevelt, very pro-war. And as you may know, during the Spanish-American War, became head of the Rough Riders. When the war was over, by November of 1898, he was already governor of New York. And by 1901, he was president of the United States. Now, when the Lusitania went down, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was his cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who then became governor of New York and then president of the United States. And the head of the British Admiralty when the Lusitania went down, as I've already mentioned, was Winston Churchill, who was also a cousin of Franklin D. Roosevelt, which makes it a little bit creepy when Pearl Harbor is approaching, and now these two men are heads of state. They are prime minister and president, respectively. Now, Roosevelt and Churchill figured that it would be easy to get America into World War II, just like they did in World War I. It's going to be real easy. All we need is another Lusitania, get the Germans to sink an American ship, and it's going to be easy. And so American ships were assigned to escort British convoys, war convoys, but the Germans didn't give them any satisfactions. The Germans knew that America coming into World War I turned the tide of the war against them, and they weren't going to let it happen again. And here's what Karl Dönitz, who was the commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, said during the Nuremberg trials. He said, quote, "A 300-mile safety zone was granted to America by Germany when international law called for only a 3-mile zone. I suggested minefields at Halifax and around Iceland, but the Fuhrer rejected this because he wanted to avoid conflict with the United States. When American destroyers in the summer of 1941 were ordered to attack German submarines, I was forbidden to fight back. I was thus forced not to attack British destroyers for fear there would be some mistake," end quote. So the attention turned to Japan. And Harold Ickes, our Secretary of the Interior, said this in 1941, "For a long time, I have believed that our best entry into the war would be by way of Japan." The attention shifted to Japan. And our Secretary of War at that time was Henry Stimson, Skull and Bones, for those of you who might be interested. In the fall of 1941, after cabinet meetings with the president, here's what he wrote in his diary. "We face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure that Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad move, overt move. The question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot." Now, this guy is Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum of U.S. Naval Intelligence, and he wrote up an 8-step plan of provocation to provoke Japan to war. Here are the closing words of that document. Quote, "Completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better." Then in a memorandum to the president, Harold Ickes wrote, "There will never be so good a time to stop the shipment of oil to Japan as we now have. There might develop from embargoing of oil such a situation as would make it not only possible but easy to get into this war." So The date is significant, by the way, June the 23rd. That's the day after Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began. Japan was very dependent on imports. They needed imports for 88% of their oil, 75% of their food, and many of their natural resources. So why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Well, they were being strangled by this embargo. Now, the official explanation for the embargo was that Japan was an aggressor nation, and the main proof of this was that they'd sent their troops into China. But what Roosevelt left out and what history books leave out is that Japanese sending troops into China was reaction to the USSR, the Soviet Union, seizing Outer Mongolia and the province of China, Xinjiang. Now, this man here, Anthony Kubik, was the chairman of the history department at the University of Dallas. Here's what he wrote in an excellent book, How the Far East Was Lost. Quote, "It was apparent to Japanese statesmen that unless bastions of defense were built in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, communism would spread through all of North China and seriously threaten the security of Japan. The Department of State seemed not to regard Japan as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in North China. As a matter of fact, not one word of protest was sent by the Department of State to the Soviet Union, despite our absorption of Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, while at the same time, Japan was censured for stationing troops in China." And I just wanted to mention something now. This double standard held throughout World War II. You might recall that World War II officially began in September of 1939 when German troops moved into Poland. But that very same month, September of 1939, Stalin and the Soviet Union invaded Poland. Well, when Germany did it, France and England declared war. When Russia did it, it was no notice whatsoever. The Japanese, from their perspective, they're across from the two big countries, the Soviet Union and China. Soviet Union was now communist. If China became communist as well, they realized that they'd be faced by communism everywhere, and they would be destroyed by it. And their fears were well-founded because, as some of you know, by 1949, China did become communist. The Japanese were correct in their predictions. So what was the final trigger for that attack on Pearl Harbor? Well, the Japanese envoys in Washington were earnestly negotiating, trying to get this trade embargo lifted. And they said, here's what we'll do. We'll pull all of our troops, overseas troops, back into Japan, all of them in Southeast Asia, South China, but we have to maintain a small foothold on North China for our own national defense. But this was rejected, and an ultimatum was sent to Japan. It was authored by Harry Dexter White, who, guess what, he was a Soviet agent inside our government. And who says he was a Soviet agent? It's mainstream now. It was acknowledged by Herbert Brownell, who was Dwight Eisenhower's Attorney General. It was in Life magazine's article on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 2012, that he was indeed a Soviet spy, as well as authoring this ultimatum. The Japanese looked at this ultimatum and said, okay, you've given a choice. We can die by starvation or die by communism. That's death either way. You've backed us into a corner. We have to fight. And that's what led to the attack on Pearl Harbor after that ultimatum was seen. To get the Japanese to attack, you got to give them a tempting target. So you ever wonder this? What was the Pacific Fleet doing in Pearl Harbor in the first place? Normally it was always berthed in the West Coast around San Diego. The man who made the decision was President Roosevelt. Now, this is the fleet commander at the time, Admiral J.O. Richardson. He was so outraged by Roosevelt's decision that he flew to Washington to talk to the president to protest this. And he gave the president a whole list of reasons why the fleet should not be in Pearl Harbor. Number one, in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, you're surrounded by 360 degrees of ocean. You're vulnerable to surprise attack from 360 degrees. Wouldn't be true if you kept it on the west coast of America. Also in Pearl Harbor, our ships were boxed in like sardines. So if a bomb missed one ship, it might hit the ship next to it. Ideal targets for bombers. In addition to that, we had to resupply the fleet over 2,000 miles of Pacific. Separating the entire Pacific Fleet for their families would be bad for morale. And he just went on and on. Well, when he was done, Roosevelt said only could give him one reason for putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor. He said it will deter Japanese aggression. Well, guess what? As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew it did not deter Japanese aggression. But historians have never held Roosevelt accountable for his decision. Instead, all the blame was put on the military. Our commanders in Hawaii were held accountable, General Walter C. Short and Admiral Husband Kimmel. By the way, Admiral Richardson had been removed from the scene after protesting moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor. He was fired by President Roosevelt. And finally, foreknowledge of the attack. Now, before anyone says there couldn't possibly be foreknowledge of the attack, our government would never let that happen to us. They'd never do that to us. You first need to familiarize yourself with these books. Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War, published in 1947 by George Morgenstern, reported for the Chicago Tribune. The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, subtitled The Washington Contribution, published in 1954 by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor on the day of attack, commanding destroyers. Admiral Kimmel's story, written by the Pacific Fleet commander, published in 1955. Infamy by John Toland, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. The BBC documentary Pearl Harbor, made in 1989. Day of Deceit, published in 2000 by Robert Stinnett, which further updated, brought us more information through the Freedom of Information Act. And if you don't believe any of those sources, guess what? Even the U.S. government said the U.S. government knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor. So what am I talking about? Well, in 1944, the Army and Navy conducted their own investigations of Pearl Harbor. And this is the Navy Court of Inquiry. And when they heard the evidence that Washington knew about the attack, the admirals flung their pencils on the floor. They completely exonerated Admiral Kimmel and laid all blame on Washington. And the Army Pearl Harbor Board, 1944, reached the same conclusion. These are the closing words of their report. Quote, up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States. So you might be wondering, how come the public didn't react with outrage to these reports? Well, the reason is because President Roosevelt and his administration ordered that they be classified and held top secret. So the public never found out, but you can read them online today. Roosevelt held them as top secret on grounds of national security, meaning his own security. How did Washington know about these attacks, by the way? Well, Japan communicated to all its embassies and consulates through something called the Purple Code, which the Japanese thought was so complex no one could translate it. But we had very talented cryptanalysts in America, and they did crack that code in 1940. So in 1941, we had these machines that would actually spit out Japanese messages, and were reading intercepts of the messages on a same-day basis. And copies of these went to just a few select individuals in Washington, and included President Roosevelt, and it also included this man, who's many considered to be Roosevelt's handler, is Harry Hopkins. He represented Wall Street. He had no official cabinet position, but he lived right in the White House, and he got to see these decoded intercepts, which means that certain people on Wall Street were also seeing them, but our commanders in Hawaii did not. Now, what did these intercepts reveal? They revealed that Japan had ordered its spies in Hawaii to identify the exact location of every American ship and dock. Now, there's nothing unusual about spies watching ship movements, but when spies are told to report the exact location of ships and dock, the implication is that they have been targeted for attack. But this information was not deemed significant enough by Washington to pass on to our commanders in Hawaii. Now, these are Japan's envoys meeting with our Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. If you've ever seen the movie Tora, 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 they give them their message-breaking relations, declaring war, and Hull reacts with shock and surprise. Oh, he's stunned. We're actually at war. Who knew, right? But actually, he'd read the declaration of war the day before that, the intercept of it, in his own office, as said President Roosevelt, 13 parts of that 14-part message. So there was no surprise at all. But again, no warning was sent to Pearl Harbor. Now, the Roosevelt administration also received personal warnings about the attack from Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, from J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, who was acting on information from a spy named Dusko Popov, from Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, who was the U.S. military observer in Java, then under control of the Dutch. The Dutch learned of the Pearl Harbor attack, and General Thorpe sent a total of 4 warnings about Pearl Harbor to Washington until finally he was told, send no more warnings. And you can see Popov and Thorpe interviewed in that BBC documentary, Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor. Colonel F.G.L. Weigeman, the Dutch military attaché in Washington, personally warned our chief of staff about the attack, and Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies received information about the attack, personally passed that information to President Roosevelt, who told them just to leave it in his hands and not to pass that information along to anyone else. And finally, with the book Day of Deceit, it was revealed through the Freedom of Information Act, we'd not only broken Japan's diplomatic codes, but the naval codes at all, and were deciphering messages such as this one. Admiral Yamamoto to Japanese First Air Fleet, November the 26th, 1941. The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order, end quote. And no one could read that message and not understand its significance.